And then are you all ready to go live?
Ready to go.
Okay, here we go. The webinar is now live. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Yes. We are so excited to have you here on this webinar that we are doing on how do we get our churches to care about peacemaking. There's been a pretty overwhelming response to people registering for this webinar, which I think shows us and hopefully tells you that if you're asking this question, you are not alone. This is a question that a lot of people are navigating, working through, and seeking resources around. So before we get started, I want to introduce myself. Hi, I'm Hailey. I'm the Director of Communications and Development at Global Immersion. And we've been doing these monthly webinars for a few years now, but we are actually now launching into an exciting series, if you will. Specifically, many of you probably know, or maybe some of you don't because you're new to our Global Immersion community. But we hosted our very first Everyday Peacemaking Summit in September. And at that summit, leading up to it, we did a survey asking people, like, what are questions that you are asking around peacemaking in your context? And there are a few questions that floated to the top. And so at the summit, we ended up doing these really special, like, roundtable conversations around these topics. And then a dear friend and genius of a man, Adam Estel, was like, why don't we turn these into webinars? And I said, Adam, that is a fantastic idea, because they were so dynamic that we were like, we have to bring these to our wider audience. So today we're addressing the question of how do I get my church to care about peacemaking? But in the next few months, we're going to have, how do I navigate the 2020 elections? How do I discern what is mine to do? How do we raise everyday peacemakers as parents and youth leaders? So those are just a few of the conversations that we have coming up, and this is our inaugural webinar in that series. Let me see. I'm going to attempt to pull up a slide here. So bear with me while we bring that up. Hey, that was not so hard. If you all can see here, while we're kind of working through this slide, if you can hop into the chat, we would love to hear your name, where you are right now as you're listening in and participating in this webinar, and then maybe what is it that brought you into this conversation today. So just take a second, the chat. If you click, there's like a little chat button at the bottom. You can click on that and then write in. So these are our 4 panelists today. Well, really 2 like strong panelists, and then John and I are going to be just kind of trying our best to facilitate through this conversation. But each of our Twitter handles are listed there below our beautiful faces, as well as our Global Immersion Twitter handle and the hashtag that we'll be using. We'd love for you to participate in this conversation on Twitter, on social media. We'll be mining some of quotes from here, and we'd love to hear kind of what is resonating with you. So feel free to grab those Twitter handles there. And participate over on Twitter. I will also put these, as soon as I'm done talking, because I can't multitask, I will put these Twitter handles in the chat as well so you can see. Okay, a little bit more just kind of orientation before I hand it over to John to give the lay of the land and kind of the structure of our webinar today. Also, near where that chat button was, there is a Q&A button or box. If you click on that, or click on that if you have a question that comes up throughout the webinar. If something is spurred by what a panelist says, or maybe you actually wrote down a series or 1 or 2 questions that you were hoping to get answered, please put those there in that Q&A because we're going to leave a good chunk of time at the end to actually go through our Q&A or your questions because we feel that that is going to be a critical part to this webinar, is actually hearing what questions are you asking, and how, if at all, can we help in navigating those. Okay, I believe that is most of our housekeeping items. I do just want to say that we are able to offer these webinars for free because we have a really incredible community of monthly donors called the Embers community. They contribute anything from $10 to a few $100s a month. And because they believe so much in the work and training that we're doing, and things like this. So if you are happily enjoying this for free, you have our Embers donors to thank for that. And if that's a community that you would like to join, we have lots of fun perks about being in that community. And I manage the community, so I'm very fond of it myself. You can email me, Hailey@globalimmerse.org, and we can talk about getting you involved. So I think that's all I have to say until later. John, you want to move us through what this conversation is going to look like?
I would love to. Thank you, Hales. So good to see all of you popping up here in the chat screen from around the country. Guatemala, I see in there, which is quite exciting. Friends with Peace Catalyst and Nazarenes involved. Okay, good. Yeah, keep introducing yourself, and also, like Hailey said, those questions as we go. My name is John Huckins. I'm the co-founding director of Global Immersion, and I have been involved in the church in formal leadership roles for 17 years. And since I was 4, and it's a really interesting conversation for me to think about how and why our churches should care about peacemaking, and what's the pathway to invite them to take that seriously, both theologically and practically. And it's probably been one of the leading questions for me in my vocation that I've wrestled with. And so I want to set this call up as to where we're coming from organizationally and why we think this matters. Have some common language, and then we're going to move it to Mindy and Matt to help fill it out with their experience as practitioners in 2 very different contexts, but both reflecting the church and a commitment to following in the ways of Jesus in our conflicted world today. So with all of that being said, when we jump into a webinar, we don't want to make presumptions about some of our language or even definitions or understanding of what peace is and what it isn't. What is peacemaking? When we talk about the church, what are we talking about? And so for those of you taking notes at home, organizationally, we're a peacemaking training organization, and we train people of faith to engage our divided world in restorative ways. We actually believe that the people of God can actually participate with God in fixing what's broken in our world. And when we see the church specifically represented in our world as anything other than an instrument of peace, it forces us to pause and ask, what have we made our priority? What have we allowed to be obstacles in our call and vocation as followers of Jesus, who not only believe that God's mission is restoration, but that follow a God in Jesus who didn't restore things that were broken through military overthrow, but through suffering and selfless sacrifice. And so we actually still believe that the church, the people of God, can be good news, and that looks like something. And it looks like very tangible, broken things being made right relationally, at an interpersonal level, and also on a systems international level. We define peace as a holistic repair of relationship. So again, that could be just in our own orientation to God and ourselves, or our neighbor, or all of the cosmos. We believe, like I said, the mission of God is restoration. It's to fix what is broken in our world. That from the moment humanity grabbed the fruit of power in Genesis 3, God made it God's mission to fix what was broken and invited us to participate in that. And so with that being said, if the mission of God is restoration, we believe that the vocation of God's people is to be peacemakers, is to participate in God's restorative work in the world. And that is a very clarifying vision. And for those of us that follow Jesus and are part of this historic tradition that we call the church, we have to ask the question, how are we, not only individuals as part of a larger global body of the church, but as local participants in church communities, whether in our neighborhood faith communities, in church plants, in historic institutional churches, and massive evangelical mega churches, how are we actually participating in God's restorative work? Are we taking peace seriously, or are we falling prey to this cultural norm that says that peace is a fairy tale that sits at 30,000 feet, and we just leave that to the international peace treaties and power brokers? Or theologically, some of our churches just haven't done any work to develop a theology for peace. In fact, we often find ourselves associating with an ethic of revenge rather than reconciliation when encountering the socio-political realities of our world. There's all sorts of excavation we have to do when we think about God's mission and our vocation in relation to a local practicing church, how we show up in this world today. And that's why we actually want to invite some practitioners to help us with that. And some of you might be in communities right now where you're like, yeah, I talk about peacemaking and my leadership thinks I'm crazy, or they think I still live in 1960, or whatever it might be. Or I say peacemaking and they define it completely differently, or they actually believe what I say about peace, but they have no idea what it looks like. They have no idea what just a next step pathway towards living as peacemakers looks like. So with all that being said, we have our friends Mindy and Matt, and both of them are pastors in different contexts. Mindy is in the larger Los Angeles, Orange County area and works within the Presbyterian denomination at a church that's been established for a long, long time. And she is someone who has made it her mission, from our experience of her, to be someone who's planting seeds of change, and specifically in their call and their practice to be peacemakers in their own contexts and among those who, many of us that sit in our church pews, don't have eyes to see in our own communities. And Mindy is someone who's pioneered that DNA in that community and been someone who's bringing change to a system that's been in place for a long, long time, which many of you here are probably part of churches like that have been around for a long time. And you're thinking, can they possibly take this stuff seriously? And if so, how would that work? And you have my dear friend Matt Nault here, who's a local pastor in San Diego. He's a church planner. He was part of a church in San Francisco that had been around for a long time, came to San Diego a couple years ago, and is now building a community whose DNA is etched with the peacemaking commitment, understanding that God's people, as he looks at his neighborhood and then the larger neighborhood of this borderlands region, San Diego, Tijuana, their community from the very beginning is taking on a commitment to be peacemakers in this context, to be people who are participating in this holistic repair relationship. And so we're going to ask some questions of him, like, how do you make that a priority in a church plant when there's a million other things demanding your time and attention and resources? What does that look like? How do you invite people into that culture? How do you create that culture? Okay, we've established a foundation for where this thing's going. And now I'm going to hand it over to Mindy. First off, if you would share in a couple minutes a little bit about what this has looked like in your context and how you've began to invite your community to care about peacemaking.
Yeah, definitely. So as John said, I'm the director of children's ministry at a PCUSA church in Orange County. And our church really has had a history of doing a lot of good work in terms of serving those that we see that are vulnerable or who are just in need. We have a homeless shelter right next to our campus. We have ministries like that. But recently, like in the past few years, we realized we're right next to and practically within a predominantly immigrant neighborhood, primarily Mexican and Central American families. And there is an organization, a nonprofit in that neighborhood that has been doing really incredible work with those families. And so, but our congregation had been kind of existing parallel to that neighborhood. And so we realized to take peacemaking seriously, we couldn't continue to live right next to this community and not have a relationship or a partnership with them. So a few years ago, we decided to, a group of us, leaders from both our church and the nonprofit, we decided to collaborate our programs and truly work together as partners in our children and youth ministries. And so that's been going on for 3 years now. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that has looked like, but that's kind of what we've experienced recently with peacemaking.
Awesome. Matt, we'll hand it to you.
Hey friends, long-time listener, first-time caller. I feel like I showed up at my favorite concert of my favorite band, and I got asked on stage to sing a song right now. So this is great. Pastor of Renew Church in San Diego, and John, I'll lead off with an answer to part of your question, which is what does it look like to bake it into the DNA of a church as we're starting? You know, we don't have bad habits, we don't have good habits, we have no habits because we're laying the foundation of a church that we knew from the beginning is designed to be in the city and for the good of all our neighbors. And as you said, in a borderland like San Diego, Tijuana, that means for all our neighbors on both sides of the border. And so that was just a non-negotiable from the beginning when we talked about how are we going to develop this community and what's the shape of it. We talk about it's a church that has the 3 R's. We talk about being reunited to God, being reconnected with other people in community, and then being redirected outward in mission to a beautiful and broken world. So, like, for example, we were down there in Tijuana meeting up with some of our ministry partners, and a fellow pastor in San Diego who's a part of a very established church. I invited him down with me to meet some of our partners that we met through Global Immerse. And as we're driving through, he's a great strategist, and he goes, I love what you're doing, but just help me understand. Like most churches would wait until they're like financially self-sustaining or like they know they're going to make it before they start pouring themselves out on behalf of their neighbors in another country. Why are you doing this now? And the answer is very easy. We're doing it now because it's part of our DNA. It's who we are. If we were to wait and put that on the workflow, you know, in a year from now, once we hit some benchmarks, we'll do these things. That's an external to our identity, but our identity is actually, it's part of who we are to follow Christ and to renew our neighborhood, our city, and our world. So in big ways or in small, we've got to get started with it now, even from the very beginning.
Love it. Thanks, Matt. Sorry, we were all on mute. Mindy, I'd love actually to hear, you know, both of you pop in at any point. But Matt, as you are building this new community, how do you know, like what areas of peacemaking your church is equipped to step into? I think maybe a question people might be asking is, the concept of peacemaking is so big, and that might be too overwhelming for people to start with. So like, how do you know what maybe are some initial steps that a community can take towards pursuing peacemaking as a church?
First step is stop, look, and listen and get to know as many people as possible in your context. So before we started anything with this church plant, before we had our first Bible study or first gathering in my living room, I took 5 months and met with hundreds of people in our neighborhood here. And I would ask them questions like, what are the pain points of this neighborhood? What are the hopes, dreams, and fears of your neighbor? What would a church look like that really is good news to all the neighbors here? And I'd always ask, what are the good things that are already taking place? Who are the good organizations that are doing great work that we should partner with? And I still have this spreadsheet of intel that I gained from that, so that from all of that information, we can start to go, all right, there's 500 things here. What are 3 things we can start with? And so, you know, we're like, we want to be a place that cares for our homeless neighbors. And I could go on for a long time about, even if you double click on that, there are a lot of reasons people are homeless in our neighborhood. Here are the handful of great organizations we should partner with, you know, and so then you kind of know where to start digging. Because I think the converse of that, people get nervous and they know they should do something, so they just start going. And I think often people can do a lot of damage that way. You know, that's why books like Toxic Charity and When Helping Hurts are actually written and well purchased. So we wanted to do it with collaboration and with a lot of relationship. And that's a major commitment of ours, is that we're not going to show up among any people group or any person, kind of roll up our sleeves and pretend like now God's at work. We come from a basis of God has been at work here. So we want to see what's already going on and then be partners in that process.
Mindy, how did so you talked about this reciprocal kind of children's ministry that you have going on. What led you into identifying that as a step your church wanted to take?
So that really started with relationships. It started over time, several years ago, with some one-on-one relationships with some folks from our congregation, really like, well, actually, it was some folks volunteering for this nonprofit, Solidarity, and they established relationships. There was trust there, so it wasn't like we went in and said, we're going to fix this neighborhood. It started through relationship. And then what happened with us in our situation is our church, the numbers were kind of going down. I don't think that's unusual for a lot of denominational churches these days. And we haven't had a ton of kids in our children's program. And we have this organization that we had already established a relationship with, and they had tons of kids, and but they were in need of volunteers. And so through our relationships, I was friends with some of their staff, and we thought, here's something we could try. Let's do this together. And so what we actually ended up doing was creating this whole new structure. We went completely away from our traditional like children's ministry and youth ministry. And what we did was we started the summer of, I think it was 2017. And normally our church would hire for youth interns, summer interns, like college age students, to run our children's programs. So we thought, let's hire 2 from our church and 2 from Solidarity, from the neighborhood. And then we went even deeper with that, and we thought, well, let's let's involve our teens in this. Solidarity already had this incredible teen leadership development program. So we thought, let's invite all of our teens into this program, and that'll be their summer program for the teens, and they will work together in this ministry. And then we thought, let's have the kids involved too, and we will combine the kids, and together this is our summer ministry. And we had it on both of our campuses. So it wasn't like everyone just came to our church campus. Half of it was on our church campus, half was over on Solidarity's campus, and we would bus these kids back and forth in vans, and it was really messy, and it was hard, but it was incredible to see these kiddos forming relationships with each other. The teens who were like, they went to high school together, and a lot of them didn't even know each other at all. They were in different groups of friends that never would have interacted if it wasn't for this partnership. And so it just really happened naturally through relationships for us.
And I guess first of all, that sounds amazing. And I think something that I'm realizing is like, that sounds, I can't even imagine that happening in a church setting, which is a pretty sad thing to admit. So amazing. I want to come visit your church someday and experience that. I'm curious how your church leadership responded. Like, did you come up with that? How did that idea come to fruition or come to your mind? And then what was that like to pitch it or to sell it or to get the whole church's buy-in?
So it wasn't just me. I cannot take the credit. There were a few of us. And I was just talking with some folks yesterday, trying to remember how this happened, because it's really funny, when you're doing things like this, when you're just on this journey of peacemaking, it doesn't always look like peacemaking while you're doing it. You don't realize it's not like, okay, now we're going to do some peacemaking, and it happens. It just happens. And so it was the youth director who worked with the teens, and then myself, I worked with the children from my church. And then it was the lead of, or a staff person from Solidarity, that nonprofit, and just hanging out. We were just talking, I think, and I think it just kind of came out of a conversation. And then we thought, well, let's try this. And so at my church, it's a PCUSA church, and so we have our governing board. It's our elders. That's our session, and so they make all of the final decisions. And so we took this idea to our committee, our education committee, and proposed it to them. And then from there it went to session, and it was approved. And there were about 27 other steps in there, things that needed to be approved. And again, it really wasn't easy. Not everybody was on board. But thankfully, our pastoral leadership, they were super supportive, and that was wonderful. It was so essential that we had some key leaders on board with that to help make it happen.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mindy. Matt, we want to ask you a question here. This is something I hinted towards in the introduction, that oftentimes in our church context, it can at least speak for us in the U.S., when you talk about peace, you kind of get that crooked look, like, what are you talking about? What's the story behind, like, what are you trying to get us to do? Are you trying to move us left or right or back into the 60s or whatever it might be? It is often seen, this work of peacemaking is seen as countercultural. We would say this is actually a way of life. This is a discipleship journey. What are some obstacles you've faced in communicating this way of life, this theology, this way of life to your community, or even to those in your wider denomination and leadership? And specifically speaking to some of the way when we talk about peace, which means not only loving neighbor but loving enemy, we can get into some like political polarization stuff, and we live in such a binary world. You're either this or that, whether it's theologically or politically. How have you navigate? You're in the borderlands, like you care about Tijuana and San Diego. Even that can be polarizing. Yep. So what are some obstacles you faced, and how do you handle some of that polarization?
Yeah. Well, the best thing about pastoring a church is the people and how energetic and energized they can get. The toughest thing about pastoring a church is it's full of people, with all of our beauty and brokenness and experiences and expectations. And so those have probably been the biggest obstacles. So, for example, I invite one person to care for our immigrant neighbors, and this person walked out of the conversation. It was kind of a large group conversation, and I let her go for a while and then followed up and just asked, hey, I noticed you left, and you're always welcome to stay or leave. I'd rather you stay, but just help me understand what's behind that. And she told me this story of, actually, she had a family member that had violence happen to them by someone who was an undocumented immigrant. And so, and I never knew that about her. And so I just realized at that moment, it's not she being against immigrant folks, it's she being heartbroken and hurt. And so that's an opportunity to pastor that person, even as we try to move forward together and expand our empathic circle of who is my neighbor, who is my brother, who's my sister. One other one, we had a guy who, we were talking about multi-ethnic reconciliation, racial reconciliation. And that was the last conversation he ever had as part of our church. He left. And I followed up with him. And he said, he was a white male. And he said, as a white, this sounds like reverse racism to me. He had all his reasons. And at the end of the day, I said to him, we'll miss you. I'm sure there's another church that's going to be great for you. This is just probably not going to be it, because we're actually, this is core to the gospel. So, those are some of the obstacles. What's helped us, I think, to navigate that is actually asking, what are we mixing into the foundation of this church? So we're not a church that's just kind of trying to win souls to Jesus. We care about your soul, and Jesus will heal it. As we say, the gospel is nothing less than the forgiveness of sins, but it's a whole lot more. And so we're trying to show people that this is not just about you and Jesus. As you read scripture from beginning to end, you read about creation, incarnation, and new creation. And so I'll show people that when Matthew, in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus would walk into a town and he would say things like, I'm the water of life, and if you drink from me, you'll never thirst. I'm the bread of life, and you'll never be hungry. I forgive you. I love you. He would say all those things. And then he would say, and go out 2 by 2 into all the surrounding towns and embody this very good news wherever you go, right? And I'll take people to Genesis 12, at the earliest covenant with Abraham, where it says, I will bless you, and through you, all the nations will be blessed. So I'm trying to show people that this is not a new idea to be a church that exists for the good of others. This is actually a part of what it means to be in the flow of God's redemptive purpose in this world. And so we're walking in this together. Can I say one more piece?
Say one more piece.
Okay, one more quickly. That's part of our communion liturgy during the service. We have communion every week. And so I get to hold up the bread and the wine and say, this meal prefigures another meal we find in the closing pages of Scripture, a meal that's marked by and this is the words of Revelation now, every people from every ethnicity and culture streaming together around the throne of Christ. It's a picture of us raising a glass to the captain of our salvation, who's made all things new. Every tear is wiped from every eye. Every injustice is done away with. Death itself is no more. And so even now we eat and drink with great hope for that coming kingdom. So it just reminds people that yes, we are citizens of whatever our respective nationality might be, but we're also citizens of a much bigger kingdom. And to try to keep that as the normalized baseline for our identity, so that when we do have the political or activist conversations, we know that they're not happening in a vacuum.
In case you were curious if Matt is a pastor, now you're really clear about him. I love it. Yeah, and I think that's some of the stuff, Matt, and Mindy, feel free to jump in. Hale's going to come in with another question soon here. But this is to invite our communities, and this is whether you are if you're listening to this in leadership context, like a formal positional leadership, or a congregant, a lay leader, you have the capacity to sow seeds of change. But it's countercultural in that you actually are helping your community grow the capacity to not only remember your identity, but then to be able to live in this conflicted world where we're being told you have to pick one way or the other, again, theologically, politically. But if you understand your core identity, you are unapologetic in your leadership about how you guide people into this. Doesn't mean you're a jerk. It means you have compassion, you understand where people are at in their journey, but your trajectory is clearly moving towards God's work of restoration, and anything that gets in the way of that, whether it's a commitment to the United States of America over and beyond the kingdom of God, or whatever it might be, that's the trajectory, and it requires this kind of clarity of leadership, which we, again, would argue this is what it means to disciple people towards Jesus in this moment, in this world. So reminder, again, as you saw Hailey put in the comments, drop questions in the Q&A, because we're going to be moving towards open Q&A here in a bit. Mindy, did you have something you wanted to add to that before Hailey goes to the next question, or do you want us to the next question?
I do. I want to add something really quickly. We're talking about obstacles in peacemaking, and one really interesting obstacle that is not so obvious, but that I've encountered, and I think it's really pretty common to see, is we have a desire to help. We have this desire to help, but it's not always in a healthy way. We can't go in and identify what we see as a problem and go in and try to fix it. It takes humility, and we really have to be willing to be honest and recognize like the power structure that we may benefit from, and work towards breaking that down. We can't just help with really, really good intentions, but while maintaining that same structure that oppresses others and keeps some of us in power. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
That's a good word. Not to camp out on this for too long, but I do feel that things being perceived as political is a huge barrier to churches moving into action in a lot of ways. So I'm curious for you, Mindy, has that been, how have you been able to navigate that in submitting ideas or suggesting things that may be perceived as political? And do you reframe it under the context of, living a life informed by Jesus' teachings, or do you lean into the politics, or how do you navigate that within your context?
That's a really tough one. I don't know that I have the right answer, but I try to avoid political language because some people will hear a word and stop listening, a specific word, no matter what side of the political spectrum they're on. And so what I try to do is use language that highlights the humanity in others and that highlights the image of God in others. And so, in my faith community, it's a pretty fair assumption that we are all followers of Jesus, or at least curious about what that looks like. So if we use language that directs the conversation in that way, using or helping others to see this is not a political thing. This is what it means to be a follower of Jesus, and to honor others and to see the image of God in others. And that I think helps, kind of steer the direction that we're going, instead of it just getting people stopping listening, when they hear all this political language, because it is very, very divisive right now.
Yeah.
Matt, you just unmuted yourself. Were you going to say something on that?
Yeah, can I add to that?
Please.
We have encountered this a bit. There are a few things. One is, and I know I can't change everybody's mind on this, but it's nice having a little church where we can't make too many people mad yet. Where like the idea that faith is not political is just, it's a category error, right? So just even like as a pastor, I think it's my role to help exegete the scriptures and teach people that when people said things in the early church like Jesus is Lord, it was loaded with political terms. They were saying Caesar is not the true king. I mean, that's a very political thing. So just so people can get away from the allergic reaction to it, but I understand they still do have it. So I get that. The other thing is, so what the day that all the tear gas was fired at the border, and John, you and I were going back and forth, and you let me bring a bunch of medical folks down. I came back and most people were so excited. So a lot of people wanted to help. Most people were glad to be a part of a church that is helping. And then some people were like, why are we doing that? It's a political thing and all this and that. And I tried to break it down to a humanitarian issue, So the idea that here's what we know. There are women and children with direct medical needs right now, sleeping outside, scared for their lives, and we have the ability to help. So at least at the very basic level, I think we should probably jump in and help. And so you can kind of, I guess the teachable theme or the transferable theme there is look for the little grain of common ground you can stand on and work from there instead of focusing on all the differences.
I'm actually going to hop in because we just got a question that I think is exactly on this vein, and one or both of you might be able to speak to it, but from someone who would prefer to remain anonymous. Whenever I try to talk about racial issues or try and get people to learn more about our racial history, it immediately gets shot down as being too political. I'm not sure how to proceed. I think, Matt, you were just kind of speaking to that about relationship and about finding that common ground, but I don't know if either of you have any specific tangible advice around this. I mean, race is one of those topics that people, like we were talking about those triggering words, like immediately triggers people. I'm curious if you have any insights into how to approach that conversation.
I find that another thing when our dear friends who say that, keep faith out of politics, usually what they mean is don't bring up anything political that challenges their politics. So I just say that with some empathy and some compassion toward whoever the person is that wants to shoot things down right away. I think some of the best words I can ask is, please tell me more about that. Please help me understand. So someone, hey, I'd like to talk about racial reconciliation. Here's what's going on in our city. And someone goes, they usually send an angry email the next day or whatever. I think they're giving you a relational opportunity there to share more what's going on in their life and their heart. And I think you come at it from the curious door if you can. I don't know a lot of people that have been argued into a new point of view on this one. I know a lot of people that have been loved into a new point of view on this one, especially as they get relationship and stories and they realize, as a person who's very privileged, being a white male with the certain education that I have the option of walking away from all sorts of things that are difficult that my brothers and sisters might not have the opportunity to. And so just helping people see that and own that as well is a big part of it.
Yeah, definitely. I don't have a good answer for that because that's something that I'm very much dealing with as well. But again, I really think it goes back to relationships, and I think it takes time, and my instinct is to be like, forget it, then I don't want to deal with it. That I don't want to deal with you. Bye. You can go because we're going to move forward with this, and that's not healthy. And so I think that it's important for people in your faith community to understand the very valuable role that each person has in being able to help others see maybe race in a different way, or to see peacemaking in a different way. I think I have an example. I have a friend who feels like she doesn't really have, she's not a leader at a church. She's retired. She doesn't know how she can help. She's been on a global immersion immigrants journey trip. And so she's seen the need for the church to be peacemakers, but she didn't know what she could do with that. But then she realized that she's in a circle of friends who are not even exposed to this language. And so a lot of those friends are people who will hear racism and then stop listening. But she has a very unique position to be able to talk to these friends, and they trust her and they love her, and they already have a foundation of trust in the relationship. And so one by one, she is able to talk about these really hard things in a space where they'll listen, and they're able to actually have a healthy conversation, whereas they may not even listen to that from from the news or from pastor. So I really think relationship is a key with so much of this.
I think one of the other gifts of this conversation, we're talking specifically about within the church, and the church is full of resources for confronting our own baggage, our own blind spots. I mean, this is something where, if our understanding of the gospel is actually good news of the kingdom, of things being fixed, being put back together, that includes ourselves. And so where do we create in our churches spaces for confession and lament? We have found that those practices alone, confession and lament, if done with sincerity and actually excavating our own blind spots, that many of them we have inherited, and it's not that we've intentionally perpetuated them, but we will continue to perpetuate them if we don't do some work of confession and lament that leads to repentance. Then we'll continue to perpetuate broken systems that are breaking people, and have all these blind spots around race and systemic injustice, and on and on and on. And so what does it mean for you and your church to actually create space for that to be played out? Not because you're pitching some partisan line, but because you're inviting people back to our historic identity and our own individual identity as ones who are always growing and confessing and seeking repair, because inevitably we're all broken in some ways. So I wonder what that could look like in our communities on this question as well. It's a great one. This could go to either of you, whichever you feels most compelled to start off, and you both could interact with it. It's tempting, and we've worked with a lot of churches like this, and understandable. But many think of peacemaking as like a programmatic add-on, that, we'll have that peacemaking program, and then we're good. Like, we can check it off our list, or let's do a peacemaking series for 5 weeks, and then we do the next 5-week series, and the next 5-week series, and the next 5-week series. I think it's great to focus on peacemaking at different times in that way. But how do you have an understanding of what success, quote unquote, looks like when your church is actually embracing a peacemaking ethic, theology, way of life? Like, we are not trying to build peacemaking programs. We're trying to say yes to a peacemaking way of life that informs every moment of every day and every interaction. So how have you two formed people into that, and yourself, and what does success, quote unquote, look like when you begin to see that taking root?
That's a really good question, and I think that's one that we, as peacemakers and as leaders in faith communities, we need to constantly be asking ourselves. I think we need to ask ourselves, why are we doing this? Is this to increase the numbers of our congregation? Is this to get more people on our church? Or is this to enter into the relationship that Jesus has invited us into with our neighbors? I think it means getting uncomfortable. I think it means relinquishing power. I think it means going from us and them to all of us, becoming belonging to one another. And I think it means like constantly checking why you're doing this. What is our focus? And like John said, lament, taking time for that constantly. So I think it's a process, and it's not, I don't think we ever arrive. We're not like, okay, we did it. We made peace. It's constantly like growing in that, checking ourselves, checking our privilege in that, and moving forward.
Yeah, in terms of ministry success, I mean, I think part of it for us, ministry success, and then kind of what's the engine and where does all this peacemaking energy come from? How do you sustain it? How do we keep it core and not have it become some add-on that we could take or leave at any given moment and still have our core identity? I want this to be such a part of the DNA of who we are that if we stop becoming a peacemaking church, we are no longer a church. Emil Brunner, theologian, said the church, exists by mission as a fire exists by burning. If you don't have anything burning, you don't have a fire. If you don't have any mission going on, you don't have a church. You might have a social club. You might have a group of people that kind of edify one another, but it's no longer the body of Christ in the mission of God, renewing all things. And so just trying to keep that front and center with all we do. So that kind of infuses our model of, discipleship. The process by which someone becomes more and more in the image of God is not simply amassing more data, hearing more sermons, filling out more fill in the blanks. Nothing wrong with that, but it's a lot more than that. It's how are you pouring yourself out on behalf of others as Christ pours himself out on behalf of you? And as you do that, then you're actually growing in prayer, because you're praying these prayers of healthy desperation. Lord, you need to come through for my neighbor because she is at the end of her resources and I don't have enough for her either. We need you to come through and show that you are God and you could do something for her she could never do for herself. I mean, those are good prayers. That's the Psalms right there. So I think that if we make kind of the process of becoming a Christian and living in the kingdom of God as something that's only mental or cerebral, then we miss out on the missional aspect. If we make it something that's only individual, then we miss out on the communal aspect. And so we want to try to keep all of those things together as we're, as we're studying scripture, as we're celebrating Eucharist together, as we're encouraging each other in our community groups, that's always baked in. Like, it's not just some special people that take this and do something with it. Everyone gets to do something with it. It might be organic or it might be organized, but we're all going to be, as I say, each of us is called to be an outpost of the resurrection wherever we go. And so for success for our church, like, we're not aiming to start a mega church. We are aiming to have mega impact. And so we know that we're actually onto something when our neighbors start saying, hey, I don't believe exactly like you guys believe, but I love what you're up to. This is a better neighborhood because you're here. I love it when our homeless neighbors say to us, you are getting known as the people here that always show up. We can count on you, right? We know that we're onto something, because what we think is happening then is our friends are actually seeing the kingdom of God, whether or not they can recognize the king at this point. It becomes show and tell with the gospel for the watching world of what the kingdom of God looks like.
That is an inspiring vision. And I love that. And then I'm also sitting here thinking of some of my past experiences within church, and like, that was not, and that's they were also not maybe saying that that's what they were doing, or that's what the mission was. But again, this question is very much coming from personal experience, but I'm like, how do you stay to your convictions and not get discouraged? Is a lot of times we are in either churches or communities that are enormous, and it's like trying to shift like the direction of a ship, or maybe it's just the culture is so different or so ingrained in a way that just a little bit of movement is met with a lot of resistance. Like, how do you keep your convictions without growing bitter? I have my own thoughts, but I'd love to hear. I'd love to hear if either of you, I'm looking more at you, Mindy, if you have anything that you want to share.
Yeah, it's easy to grow bitter. It's easy to get burnt out and to feel hurt. I think what I do, what encourages me, and remember, I'm in the context of children's ministry. I look at the children and I see the relationships that they have with one another. I see them living their lives in community with one another without the barriers that we put up, without the rules that we've established that don't need to be there. I see my own children. My husband and I have 3 kids, and they're actually a part of this partnership that we have with the nonprofit. And I see them learning Spanish so that they can communicate better with their friends and with their parents. That encourages me, because otherwise, I can get in a place that's just really low, and it's hard. I mean, this whole peacemaking journey that we're on, it's beautiful. It has been absolutely incredible, but it's also been really hard. And so I look at the children. Another thing that I do that I think it's really important for all of us in whatever ministry or program we're in or a part of, is to find someone else that is on the same page with you and support one another through that. I think that's really important, to have someone who can listen to you, talk to you, can bounce ideas off of each other and support each other. And I thankfully have that, and that has helped me a lot.
Yeah, Matt, how do you stay kind of convicted in that core when you're also having to see those convictions lend to people leaving the door as you're in this like startup mode? How do you stay grounded in that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the day that guy left because he didn't want to be a part of a racial reconciliation style church that prioritizes these things, I think we lost like 10% of our congregation that day. He was just one person, but we only had 10 at the time. You don't want to see that. So when you ask, how do you remain, get from getting discouraged? I'm sitting here looking over my shoulder. If anybody knows, let me know. I'm looking for answers from the people on the side chatting here. C.S. Lewis said, if you want to keep your heart really safe, just lock it up and don't give it away to anybody. And this is a calling to give our hearts away all the time. I mean, you're so vulnerable, you're so exposed, you're so out there, you pour yourself out. Therapists talk about anybody in the helping profession experiences what's called vicarious trauma, where you carry the trauma that the people you serve walk with. And so it's incumbent upon us to find healthy ways to deal with that trauma, because if we don't find healthy ways, we'll find unhealthy ways. And we'll do damage to ourselves or to the communities that we lead and we're a part of. And so, as Mindy said, having trusted friends that you can vent to and share with and cry on each other's shoulders. John is one of my best friends. There's probably been as much therapy for me on his front porch as there has been in my therapist's office, and he doesn't charge as much, so that's really great. I think also you keep a big picture in mind. I mean, when you deal with the details, it can get not right-sized. It can be out of scale. So you can have a hard hour or a hard day or a tough week or a tough month. But I think if you can step back and go, kind of what Martin Luther King did, he had said, the arc, the moral trajectory of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Like, I know where this is going, and so I can walk on this path even when it's really difficult. And then sometimes you just need to go and do an old-fashioned lament and say things are not the way they're supposed to be. If I was writing the story, it would have a very different chapter at this point. And yet, God, what I want to do now is trust you in what happens next. And that's kind of just where we are, and that's okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt.
Yep.
I'm going to do one more call for Q&A questions, because we'll be hopping over there in a minute or so. So if there's any burning questions that you have, or even just slightly simmering questions, please put those in the Q&A box so we can run them past our panelists. Matt, when you were talking, it made me think of, I think sometimes also we want to be the messenger. Like, we want to be the person that when we bring something up, like it changes this person's perspective, or all of a sudden it's like this moment of like enlightenment. And we don't always get to see that. I think I really resonate with what you were saying. That Martin Luther King quote is like, really important to me and grounding in my peacemaking practice is that I don't always get to see to fruition like these seeds that I'm planting. And I have to live this life that I feel called into and what I see Jesus being modeled or what Jesus modeling. But that doesn't mean that I always get to like have these really sweet moments of change. And sometimes I do, but often I don't. And that doesn't mean that the work that we're doing or the conversations that we're having are not moving us towards that greater arc of justice. So thanks for that reminder.
Let me toss one to both of you if you'd interact with this. Less a question and more a word to anyone that's listening right now, whether you are a pastor listening to this thinking, gosh, I have been given stewardship in my role in this community, and it is terrifying on how to lead in this moment in history. All the political stuff we spent time talking about is got me completely messed up, and every moment I'm just seeking any kind of discernment on how to lead with conviction and also be a pastor who's walking with people through their own stuff. Maybe it's a congregant who feels like they're part of a community that talks a big game but doesn't actually live into what they say they are called to be and do in the world. Or maybe it's a congregant who's actually part of a community who completely dismisses any talk of peace or peacemaking as an illegitimate expression of the gospel. What do you two say to those folks? Like, what's your word to, you could pick one of those three characters, or it could be a collective word to those that are listening in, because people are listening because they care about their churches taking this way of life seriously. So what's your charge? Mindy, let's start with you.
Oh, that's hard. I think I would say to really try to discern God's voice in what it is that you feel God calling you to do. And I would also say to listen to the voices of the oppressed, because I think that is God's voice and the voices of the oppressed. Those are really what guide me. And then if God is perhaps calling you into on a new journey, maybe it's time to leave the institution that you're at and go to a new place. Or maybe it's not. Maybe it's time to take a break, take care of yourself a little bit and kind of refocus. But it's a hard one. And I think that's an individual, it's different for everybody. There's no cookie cutter answer for that.
Yeah. For us in the stage of growth and life of our church where we are, I mean, church plants they attract a lot of people that want to do something. So I think for us, a lot of that is helping people to interact wisely and what it looks like to move toward the pain points of our neighbors with thought and with care. And so there's a lot of that, but still you have, a lot of people in churches, I think, like they don't want to do the hard work of knowing their neighbor and moving toward people's pain points and being inconvenienced and, spending more money on folks and all that stuff, but they love being a part of a church that's doing it. And I love having them. That's great. I think that's a starting point. So I try to bring people along with us for what we're doing so they can see, like, we're not just looking for warm bodies to do more churchy stuff. I actually think this is part of God's plan for developing us into truly alive human beings. And so, I always say, if you want to feel wealthy, just go serve someone who's poor. I think gratitude is the antidote to a lot of our entitlement. So I think when we move into self-sacrifice, care, generosity, pouring ourselves out, I think we actually come more alive because we're modeling and following the Jesus that we claim to follow. And so that's kind of an overarching thought of when I'm calling people into this. I'm not calling them to do my thing. I'm actually calling them to do something I think is really, really good for them in the end as well. So I end, if you listen to our podcast of our sermons, you probably hear half the sermons end with, and when you do, the world will never be the same. But you know what? You'll never be the same. So
Awesome. Thank you both very much, not only for like this hour has been great, but more than that, your lives are inspiring. We are grateful to be able to pick your brain as practitioners, as fellow sojourners in this way of life together. So thank you for your life that makes these words come to full color. And
thank you.
well, you bet. Hail, is there anything else that needs to be said before I do some final thoughts here?
No, I think you're good to move us across the finish line.
Okay. Hey, for all of you listening in, thank you. There's going to be a guide that comes out in a couple days. We are committed to, again, not just have one-off resources, but something that's constantly helping us move towards practice in our own communities. That guide will be based on the conversation we just had. So keep an eye out for that PDF. If you are a church, in a church, and you're talking about this specifically, how do we actually become a community of peacemakers, instrument of peace in our neighborhood, in our world? We have what we call pathways, which function as a cohort. They can be 1 year up to 3 years, where our team walks with your team of influencers and leaders to begin to build this DNA of peacemaking into the life of your community. You're always welcome to reach out to us on that. We have a workshop series that is targeted towards faith communities to integrate some of these learnings again into our own practice. We have one general everyday peacemaking workshop where we'll come to a church and spend a day or two with your community. We have two new workshops that just came as part of this workshop series that we launched at the summit. One is called Beginning Within. It talks about the contemplative practices that are necessary for us to be sustained as peacemakers. And the last is Enneagram for Peacemakers. Many of you are probably familiar with Enneagram. How does our Enneagram type inform the way we show up in our everyday spaces of conflict as proponents and actively move towards peace? Two other things. We have a trip to Israel, Palestine, November 2020. That's almost a year from now, a little over a year from now. There will be a link to jump onto the interest list for that in the follow-up email. And our next webinar, as Hailey said, this is part of a series of webinars coming out of these core conversations that have risen up in the everyday peacemaking movement. The next webinar will be next month around how do we navigate the 2020 elections with our friends and our family. Real easy conversation. We got that figured out, not a problem.
We also have a trip coming up to San Diego, Tijuana in February, right? So we'll include that in our follow-up as well. Lots of ways to stay engaged.
Mindy and Matt, their contact information, their churches will also be in that follow-up email, ways to stay connected with them. I'm sure they'd be open to communicating with you if you reach out to them directly. Ways to support their work will be involved in there as well. So again, thank you to both of you. Thank you to all of you who listened in. Let's get out there and after it as we walk with our communities, our churches, to live as instruments of peace, who we've been called to be all along in our conflicted world. Thanks for jumping in. We'll see you later.
Thanks, everyone.